Good evening. I'm Harry Smith, sitting in tonight for Dan Rather. Merry Christmas. Just before the Kremlin cameras clicked on today, Mikhail Gorbachev said to himself, quote, "When you have to go, you have to go." He then officially resigned as president of the Soviet Union and turned over the nuclear codes to the new top man, Russia's Boris Yeltsin. You are looking at a live shot of the Russian flag flying tonight over the Kremlin. Tom Fenton begins our coverage of this historic day.
Tonight, the red flag was taken down from the Kremlin, where it has flown since the 1917 revolution. The Soviet Union it symbolized is now dead. In its place, they raised the flag of Boris Yeltsin's Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev, the eighth and last ruler of the communist empire founded by Lenin, announced he was quitting. He appeared sad and broken, but hoped history would give him credit.
Society has been granted its freedom, has been politically and spiritually unchained, and that's our biggest achievement.
The world, too, benefited when Gorbachev appeared on the scene.
The Cold War is over. The arms race has been stopped, along with the insane militarization of the country that has distorted our economy, our mentality, and morality.
It's the former Soviet Union that is now in trouble. Gorbachev acknowledged that he has left the country in a dangerous state.
The old system has crumbled before the new one has begun to work, and the crisis in society has become greater. I know of the dissatisfaction with the current situation, the bitter criticism of the government, and of my own performance.
In many respects, the living conditions of the Russians are now worse than when Gorbachev took over. But people watched his farewell speech more in sadness than in anger. He had a wonderful beginning, this woman says, but a sorrowful end. I personally supported him, and now I'm simply sorry for him, both as a politician and as a person.
And I am concerned that you are no longer citizens of a great country. The consequences may turn out to be very difficult for everyone. It's critically important to preserve the democratic achievements of the past few years.
The future now looks grim for the citizens of the former Soviet Union. Prices for food and energy in Russia will go up several %100 next week. There's a prospect of mass unemployment, and civil war is brewing in the shattered outreaches of this once great superpower. In a way, the country is back to 1917. Gorbachev came on the scene as a superstar politician, a dazzling reformer in the eyes of the world. He made his exit as a failure in the eyes of his countrymen, but given the size of his contribution to world peace, a magnificent failure. Tom Fenton, CBS News, Moscow.
President Bush developed a warm relationship with Gorbachev, and he will say goodbye in a Christmas night address from the Oval Office.
Good evening, and Merry Christmas to all Americans across our great country. During these last few months, you and I have witnessed one of the greatest dramas of the 20th century, the historic and revolutionary transformation of a totalitarian dictatorship, the Soviet Union, and the liberation of its peoples. As we celebrate Christmas, this day of peace and hope, I thought we should take just a few minutes to reflect on what these events mean for us as Americans. For over 40 years, the United States led the West in the struggle against communism and the threat it posed to our most precious values. This struggle shaped the lives of all Americans.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the one and the only Awakener podcast, the best podcast in the history of the world. And as soon as you listen to me, you can search high and you can search low for comparables, and you will never find somebody who is kind of equal to me on the internet. This is a vastly different perspective explaining to you what is going on. And sometimes I come on here and I just do this kind of out of frustration. If you look back at kind of my episodes, you'll figure out right away I do not do an episode every single day. So many people put so much information out, and the general population is being completely lambasted with a propaganda war on all fronts, so people don't really understand what is going on. Well, what is going on? What on earth is going on? Well, you are in the midst of a world war. 20 years ago, if you went on the internet and you kind of did a search and you said, well, there's a war going on over the Strait of Hormuz, you'd find actually articles from military people or ex-military people, and they would tell you that you would be in the middle of a world war. Well, what's happening today? There is a battle going on for the Strait of Hormuz, and yeah, you're obviously in the middle of a world war, but the general population is living their lives completely oblivious in this. And this is precisely why there's a propaganda war on television and why people are tuning into the latest news and latest events, and people are not being told the truth about what is going on because they just can't tell you. They can't tell the general population what the purpose of COVID is. They can't tell you the general population what the purpose of the vaccine. They can't tell you about our elections. They can't tell you about all this because everybody would freak out. So why do I do this? I kind of do this and I come online when I kind of want to vent about something, and really kind of the idiots are getting to me, which is the propaganda that's coming out all in the news and all kind of the influencers and people talking about what is going on, and they don't understand it. And it's so simple. It's really, 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 really simple. You live in a fallen world, okay? There's been a historical battle for basically thousands of years in the evolution of the Western world. And today, if you live in Europe, let's see, Australia, New Zealand, if you live in Canada, if you live in the United States of America, you are aligned with what's called the U.S. industrial complex, which is the main backer of the Western world. Yes, there is a hidden relationship with Israel, duh. But I like where you're going with your thinking, but you're completely wrong on this issue. There's also a hidden agenda to erase or take control of this complex and race totalitarianism. And this is what I talk about in this podcast, which is a communist conspiracy. If you took somebody back to 1989, it would be very easy to kind of differentiate, well, wow, our enemies are the communists. Everybody hated communism in the USA in 1980s. Everyone loved Israel. Nobody loved Iran. Everyone thought you were crazy if you kind of rooted for Iran. Nobody believed in Palestine whatsoever in the Western world. Everybody kind of had some moral values or strongholds. We didn't have people with pink hair and dresses or men with dresses running around. And ask yourself, what has happened? What has happened is a propaganda war, or the system that we live in, a propaganda system, which is, listen, man, there's got to be some kind of propaganda or some kind of control mechanism in a society that you live in. This network has been taken over, which is a globalist establishment. Now everybody says, okay, well, the globalists and all this kind of hidden agenda and everything, like, you're wrong. Who do these people work for, ladies and gentlemen? They work for our enemies. They work for the Soviets. It is a giant Soviet conspiracy to take over this Western world. So Yuri Bezmenov was politically correct in everything that he said. And he talked about in the 1980s that the demoralization of America was complete by 1984. So if you go back, and what he's basically saying is that there was communists basically everywhere in America in 1984. Okay, but the problem here is that they were not well trained and they were not well organized. They didn't have a system of government. They didn't have financing. They didn't kind of have like an agenda. So what really happened in 1989 was the fake collapse of the Iron Curtain, or the insertion of the Trojan horse into this U.S. complex, which I call the globalists who are working for our enemies. George Soros and crew and his money, and George Soros is obviously, like, look at his father. I believe was his father, or Bill Gates' father, related to Soros, they're best friends. All these kind of people are all intertwined, and this is about a network of hardline communists in the Western world who are organized, who are financed, who are creating their system of government, who are taking over our propaganda network to lead us to our fall and the taking over by our enemies. It's that simple, okay? So the purpose of this podcast and what I've talked about is detailing this for you, detailing their mechanism of what they're going to do, and obviously detailing the period of time that you're in. The period of time that you're in is what's called the war. So this is the organization of a giant war that has taken place over 50 years to have a giant war where the Western world, the U.S. complex, is going to lose. Okay, so how are they going to do that? Well, if you go back to my previous shows, and this is relating to Iran, the mechanism, obviously how they're going to do this, is called EMP weapons in space, which means that Iran had to have a nuclear facility or a nuclear program developed from a very, very early time. And I talked about ex-Soviet states, specifically Ukraine, which everyone knows about, and another ex-Soviet state called Kazakhstan, and especially Kazakhstan aiding Iran in creating a nuclear program, which means during the collapse, Kazakhstan gifted Iran 2 nuclear weapons, which allowed their scientists to spend a number of years developing a nuclear weapons program covertly ever since 1992. In 2001 and 2004, that kind of period of time, Iran already had an advanced nuclear program where they were actively kind of enriching uranium and they were preparing for this. But they ran into a problem. And the problem that Russia, China, and crew are having is very, very simple. They can't just simply use their nuclear weapons on the United States of America. They simply can't just put EMP weapons in space and kind of seed this revolution or this period of chaos that they're going to usher in, where they're going to do a violent changeover of power in the world. They can't do that with using their own material, because their own material is traceable, and this leads to consequence of action if they failed. So remember the Soviets way back in the day when they were seizing control of the Soviet Union. They failed in 1905, and 1905 brought about great consequence because many of them were killed by the czars. The same thing goes for today. A takeover of the US complex, engineering a war, and the failure of this war is going to have drastic consequence on them. And this is something that they were putting in place a plan so that they could not get caught. They would have a cheating mechanism. That cheating mechanism was Barack Obama in 2009. Now, Barack Obama was a trained Soviet asset, like I told you before. Nobody knows this. Nobody will ever talk about this. But the purpose of his presidency was obviously, number one, COVID, destroying the U.S. system completely, and lastly, obviously, the U.S. uranium. The U.S. uranium needed to be put onto these weapons in Iran and obviously North Korea to do this violent changeover of power, mainly because Russia and China were too scared to do it on their own. And this would give Iran and North Korea the ability to basically lie and say, well, after this war happened and after everything kind of hit the ground, well, this nuclear stuff in the atmosphere, that came from you. It didn't come from us. So we weren't at fault for all this. And the acceptance kind of a loss, the acceptance of society in the Western world to this loss would be brought about because the people in charge of us would say, well, we lost this war because of the US. And this is really why Barack Obama was put there in office. Now, Iran's nuclear program is far more advanced than you think it is. And the events that are unfolding today are because Iran has a very advanced nuclear program. They have miniaturized nuclear weapons, and they have EMP weapons in space. And this is why a war is going to happen and has to happen to basically dispose of our enemies to save the Western world. I know it's horrible. It's horrible. But this discussion in Iran that the general population is having right now over the Strait of Hormuz and kind of the daily talk is really something that I've talked about for a number of years, a long, long time ago. And if you went back and you kind of listened to it, you would be like, wow, it's all coming to fruition now. Yes, buried in Iran and their nuclear facilities is the US uranium that came from allies of America, which came from Canada, the European Union, was weaponized by Barack Obama, and they're all implicated in this. And this is really why we're living in such a dangerous time right now. The general population is kind of being seeded this idea of waking up to this covert attempt by the communists to take over the US complex and their violent revolution or change of power they want to do. And it's being done very, very slowly. But as this is happening, we're getting very, very close to what's called the red pill moment, where everyone looks at me and kind of what I've been talking about and goes, wow, this guy was way ahead of his time. What on earth was he talking about? So just to kind of recap one more time, because I know it's really crazy. The Soviet Union collapse was faked, which means Gorbachev, Yeltsin, all these people, Putin, were all working together. The purpose of this was to basically cede to the United States of America a Trojan horse in the idea of George Soros and obviously all his money. And the US complex believed George Soros. George Soros took control of Ukraine in 1990 or 1991. They took control, obviously, in the United States of America in 1993 on Bill Clinton's watch. George Soros came over, they set up their organizations, and they began to seed and organize. And obviously the person who let this all happen is George H.W. Bush, who knew that the Iron Curtain collapse was faked. Okay? So obviously the taking over of the US complex in 1993 and the seeding obviously of George Soros' money and the financing of all this communist doctrine and all the Black Lives Matter and all the stuff, the revolutionary people he has, this is the silent war. And obviously it's the putting in of Barack Obama, who was organizing this war for our enemies ahead of time. And then what was going to happen on Hillary Clinton's watch. So yeah, I know this is like a mouthful, but this is kind of why this podcast is vastly different than anything out there, really, because I'm kind of detailing a totalitarian government that is operated in secret and has kind of been progressing to putting this plan into action. And people really have to kind of ask themselves, well, is, this guy who has this podcast, Matt, is he being kind of genuine? Is this true? So the first thing you want to do is you want to counter-analyze the evidence, okay? So first of all, you want to analyze George Soros, and you want to analyze, is what he's doing and what he did before, was that real? So you have to ask yourself, why would he feed the Soviet Union all this anti-Marxist propaganda in all these nations, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia? Why would he finance dissidents on the street or newspapers who printed articles against the Soviet Union? Why would he do that? And then all of a sudden, after the collapse, come over here to the Western world and fund exactly the opposite. Fund pro-Palestinian movements, fund all these people in the streets, fund, obviously, again, newspapers and organizations that are propagating communist viewpoints everywhere. Why would he do this? And the answer to you is that it's a lie. So if it's a lie, then your next answer should be, should I analyze Vladimir Putin? Should I analyze the military agenda of Russia? The military agenda of Russia is exactly the same. They're financing all the Middle Eastern nations still covertly. They were financing Syria. They were financing Iran. And then obviously you look at, the government there. Do Russians live in a democracy now? The purpose of the Iron Curtain collapse was, like you heard in the beginning of the movie, or the beginning of the show, to basically institute democracy, where people of Russia had a vote. Do you believe for a second that Russians have a fair vote? Do you believe that Vladimir Putin, who has been in control of this entire government the entire time, basically except for maybe 4 years or 5 years, do you believe that he legitimately has control in Russia and people absolutely love him? Do you believe there are fair elections in Russia? There is no, obviously, killing of dissidents or people who are... There is. It's all over the news. So you have to ask yourself this question. Is everything I've been told by our media complex about the Iron Curtain, is that real? It's not. And so if it's not real, at what point are we at? And honestly, ladies and gentlemen, they almost had us. They were literally actively, they had taken complete control of every aspect of the Western world and our governments. They were literally embedding our enemies. They were selling out our uranium. They were preparing this giant war against them. And in their last hours of this giant war, it all went south. Anyways, that's enough for today. I know it's a lot, but if you're confused, just go to theawakener.ca. It's easy to understand. Take care.